So for the third reading today, I've chosen passages from the Hebrew and Christian scriptures that talk about, God's knowledge and God's kind of planning for our incarnations. And I've taken them in chronological order, the order in which they were actually written. The first is from Psalm 139, and the Psalms are ascribed to King David, who flourished around the year 1000 BCE. He says this: "My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place. When I was woven together in the depths of the earth, your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be." The second one from the prophet Isaiah, who flourished around the year 750 BCE. "Listen to me, you islands. Hear this, you distant nations. Before I was born, the Lord called me. From my mother's womb, he has spoken my name." The third one from the prophet Jeremiah, who flourished around 600 BCE. "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I sanctified you and ordained you a prophet to the nations." And finally, Paul's letter to the Galatians, written about 70 of the Common Era. "But even before I was born, God chose me and called me by his marvelous grace." These are words inspired by God. So if I were to give today's homily a title, I would call it "Before I Formed You in the Womb," because for the month of April, as I mentioned last Sunday, I want to take as a theme the abortion debate. So last Sunday, I started off by looking at the two poles of any debate, two very important poles. Whatever the topic under discussion is, there are two important poles that we have to represent. And the first pole is the realization that if there are intelligent, spiritual, moral people at both sides of any debate, then there must be some merit to both sides of the debate. So we need to listen and learn from each other. That's the first pole. The second pole is that not all viewpoints are equally valid. And so, for instance, the viewpoint of the Ku Klux Klan and of Martin Luther King Jr. on African Americans, are not equally valid. So it's actually a performative contradiction to claim that all viewpoints are equally valid. That's a logical fallacy, because you're now making the statement that this is the top, this is the most important viewpoint, that all viewpoints are equal. So it's a logical fallacy. Now, in any debate or any discussion, it's very important that we make our moral decisions, balancing these two poles of the debate. So I talked about that last Sunday. And then I spent time looking at defining life. What does life actually mean? And then secondly, what does human life in particular, what does that look like? And then thirdly, I looked at what does personhood, who becomes a person and who decides who is a person? And then finally, I looked at ensoulment. When does the soul, merge with the developing fetus or embryo or fetus in the womb? Today, I want to continue, and I want to look at some of the legal aspects and some of the medical aspects and some of the moral dimensions when we're talking about the issue of abortion. So firstly, I want to distinguish, legal issues, the legal distinction between killing and murder. Killing is taking a life. Murder is doing it illegally. So there are some instances where the law allows people to take a life, and if the law doesn't allow it, then the taking of a life is called murder. So there's a distinction between killing and murder. So for instance, illegal killing in many places right now it's legal to kill in war. It's legal to kill in self-defense. It's legal to kill in capital punishment, and it's legal to kill in abortion in some places. Now, what's illegal in one jurisdiction may be legal in another jurisdiction. So we have to try to differentiate then between the notion of killing and the notion of murder, because murder is an illegal killing according to the laws of the country or the place in which you live. So that's the first distinction, a legal distinction. I want to look then at who are the constituents in the decision about whether or not to abort a baby. And so I created a moral equation. I call it AX1 plus BX2 plus CX3 plus DX4 is the morality of making this decision. And X1 is the mother. X2 is the father, X3 is the child, and X4 is society. And then these factors are weighted differently. A, B, C, and D are weighted differently depending on the costs to each party, about the financial costs, the kind of physiological costs, the psychological costs, and the moral costs. So you have to weight these factors very, very differently as you come to your decision. Now, the issue is that because the unborn cannot represent itself, society has two kinds of responsibility. It has a responsibility to itself, and it has the responsibility for the unborn, because there's nobody else representing the unborn in this decision. And so society very often intervenes and countermands the decisions that maybe even parents are making. So society, for instance, says it has the right to override the parents if a 5-year-old child is being abused at home. So society intervenes. So society has two responsibilities, to society itself and to the child who's being abused. Now, I want to go in specifically and in detail to the moral dimension of making choices like this. Now, I think that morality is to ethics as engineering is to pure mathematics. So morality is applied ethics, where engineering is applied mathematics. And I would say, in fact, that ethics is the science of living and morality is the art of living. And you need the two pieces together. What I've come to realize in my study of history and in living in 3 different continents is that I do not believe that there's any such thing as an absolute moral law. Sometimes it is necessary, even good, to steal or to tell lies, depending on the situation in which you find yourself. If I'm hiding a group of, an ethnic group in my mission in Kipsarman, while another ethnic group is trying to kill them, and they ask me, are there any Kikuyus hiding in your mission? And I say no, even if they are. So it is necessary and good sometimes to break the laws, because there are no absolute moral laws. There are, however, absolute moral values. And so, for instance, the absolute moral values are stuff like respect for life, respect for truth, respect for property, respect for sexuality, respect for other people's reputations. So we need to differentiate then between, moral values and moral laws. There are no absolute moral laws, but there are absolute moral values. So this is how we steer the ship of making these kinds of choices. And then another factor is there's a kind of a yang way of making moral choices, and there's a yin way of making moral choices. And so the yang method of making moral choices is the application of willpower to reveal our legislated edicts. So the yang system of making a moral decision is, okay, here's what the law says, here's what the legislated edicts tell me, here's what the revealed word of God says. Now I simply apply willpower to those edicts, and that's a moral choice. The yin moral reasoning is slightly different. It asks, where do the ripples end? So it is context-dependent thinking. What will the long-term outcomes of my decision be? So it's not just, I'm going to just exercise willpower, and look at what the law tells me. I'm going to look at where do the ripples end? What are the long-term consequences of the decision I'm about to make? Now, I think personally that it's a question of all three. I have to look at the ripples, I have to look at the principles, and I have to look at the willpower. So any moral choice I make, I think, has to factor in these three pieces. What are the ripples? What are the long-term consequences of the decisions I'm making? So, for instance, in Native American Indian tradition, they say, what would be the results of the decision I'm making on the 7th generation yet to be born? So the ripples are important. Also, the principles are important because we have forged these in the kind of in the furnace of human history throughout the ages. And willpower, obviously, is important. So for me, there are three parts to it. There are the ripples, the principles, and the willpower. Now, there was a famous cardinal, the Cardinal Berdenin, who was the Archbishop of Chicago many years ago. And he talked about, he used the image of, he called it the seamless garment approach. And what he was saying was, any discussion of the sanctity of life must be evenly applied to the death penalty, self-defense, warfare, and abortion. You can't have one set of rules for the death penalty and another for abortion, or one set of rules for self-defense and another for warfare. So he called it the seamless garment approach. So in order to be consistent then in our moral thinking, we need to look at this, at all of these issues, any place where life is being taken, and apply the same kind of thinking to this. So it must be a seamless approach to the value of human life. Now, when you look at situations like, for instance, making determinations about an abortion based on a compromised fetus or a deformed fetus, that we only want to give birth to physically perfect bodies. Now, the problem is that there have been many physically perfect bodies that grew up to be criminals, tyrants, and mass murderers. So, giving birth to a physically perfect body is no guarantee that you're going to get metaphysically perfect human beings coming from it. And all of us have had the experience of looking and dealing with and knowing people who are born in really deformed or compromised bodies who turned out to be pure incarnated love. Anybody who's had the privilege of interacting significantly with Down syndrome kids realize that, these are pure souls. And so the idea that, the deformed condition or a compromised fetus is the only indication, that's faulty, because we provided perfect bodies that grew up to be criminals and imperfect bodies that grew up to be incarnated love. So it's a much more complex issue. And then we have the issue of what I would call cosmetic abortion. So we do a test on the fetus. It's going to turn out it has blue eyes. Kill it. I don't want a blue-eyed baby. And so we have kind of racially motivated abortions. So this is another part of the equation. Now, in my own personal thinking, I think there are times when it is important to break any moral law because they're not absolute. So what are some of the exceptions? In my thinking, if the mother's health is seriously affected physiologically or psychologically by the pregnancy, that's an important factor for me. Similarly, if there are very significant familial or financial repercussions to another pregnancy, that is a factor that I would take into account. And certainly in the case of rape or incest, having the insult of bearing and raising the perpetrator's baby, for me, is sufficient reason. But in each case, for me, termination needs to happen as early as possible within the first trimester. And secondly, any decision in this arena must be made from a conscience, but a well-informed conscience. Even the Catholic Church admits that the ultimate moral authority is conscience, but it must be a well-informed conscience. You can't just go with what you want to do. You have to go with what is the right thing to do in the circumstance. Now, throughout history, I see this on a spectrum where, for instance, for many, many years in many, many different cultures, society would say to a female, you're a woman, bear children. And to a male, you're a man, bear arms. And so the women had very little control of their reproductive rights, and the males had very little control over their physical integrity. They were sent off to war to be cannon fodder. So that's where we came from in this issue. So this phrase, take your hands off my body, that I agree with that, but doesn't this apply as well to modern medical mandates that we're forced to take medical procedures that we don't agree with? And so again and again and again, this issue comes up for debate. Now, to look at the side of the father and the side of the mother. Currently, in our situation, if the woman decides to carry a baby, the father is mandated to support the child to age 18, financially and otherwise. But he has no legal right to insist on an abortion. If the father doesn't want a baby, he has no legal right now in our country to insist on an abortion. And if he does want the baby, he has no right to veto the abortion. So at that stage, then, one of the important people is taken out of the equation of the decision-making process. So throughout history, what I've seen is that there's a kind of, I would call it a society-specific seesaw. In some places, there are no rights, but there are lots of obligations. And in other places, there are no obligations, but full rights. And then you've got a question like a teen pregnancy. Is there any parental input permissible or necessary if a teenage finds herself pregnant? So there's this extraordinary spectrum that you see in our world even right now. In some areas, there is no abortion allowed under any circumstances. In other situations, there's a restricted choice based on the stage of the pregnancy and the cause of the pregnancy. In other places, abortion is allowed for any reason whatsoever right up to the stage of birth. And then in China, even worse, there's mandated abortion in China. Chinese parents are only allowed to have one child. And the result has been, because of this policy, there's a huge demographic discrepancy in China right now between males and females. The females were killed, and now there's a huge preponderance of males that can't find partners. And there's a very quickly aging population in China. So there are huge sociological factors as well. Now, I need to address a very important medical kind of a look at what an abortion involves. Now, if you're a little bit squeamish, you may need to turn off your volume for the next minute and a half or so. But it is very important to understand, what does abortion actually mean? I watched a video a few weeks ago of an MD, a woman, a gynecologist who works in a family planning place, and she had conducted over 1,200 abortions. And then she came to this realization. So a late-term abortion would be anything from 24 weeks, the end of the second trimester, anything after 24 weeks. Now, what actually happens in the process of a late-term abortion is that, firstly, there are no pain meds given to the unborn. So the procedure is totally, experienced by the unborn child as an extraordinary torture. There are no pain meds given whatsoever. The process then is that they will dilate the cervix and insert a forceps which has lots of sharp teeth at the end. And then they're working blind. There's no imaging possible, so they're trying to grab something inside in the womb. And then when they find something, they don't clamp down on it and pull it really hard to get it out. It doesn't come out easily. And they don't extract the whole thing in one go. The first time they extract, it may be a leg that comes out. The second time, an arm. The third time, the spine. And then finally, they'll grab the head and crush the head. And then what they have to do in the clinics, they have to carefully put all the body parts together on the table to make sure that they got everything out. So they have to reconstruct the baby on the table in order to prevent a bleed out or an infection from the mother. So that's actually what the process looks like. So it's important that we know what the process actually entails medically. In conclusion, then, I would say this. In the last 2 weeks, then, I've looked at the 4 parties to the decision: the mother, the child, the father, and society. And I've looked at all the various factors for all the parties. I've looked at the legal aspects, the medical aspects, the psychological aspects, the emotional aspects, the mental aspects, the sociological aspects, and the spiritual aspects. And I've given a thorough pro and con multimodality survey of a very complex issue, because I'd be remiss as a spiritual director of a spiritual community if I didn't address this complex and hugely important topic. Now, similarly, you owe it to yourself and to society to be fully informed of all aspects of the issue and to not simply be triggered emotionally by one particular perspective. You owe it to inform yourself completely and then make the decisions. Now, conscience is the ultimate arbiter of moral decisions, but it must be a fully informed conscience. And that takes a lot of work, a lot of research, and a lot of study. And so in conclusion, I would say this: whether we're talking about war or abortion or self-defense or execution, experiment Homo Sapiens Sapiens needs to evolve beyond the very primitive position that taking a human life is a good way to solve a human problem. Namaste, my brothers and sisters.